Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Monday, June 17, 2024. Maryland Governor Wes Moore issues pardons for more than 175,000 marijuana convictions, calling it the most sweeping state-level pardon in any state in American history, and that it's the start of remediating harm done in the past by the war on drugs. Democratic presidential reelection campaign of Joe Biden puts out a TV ad taking aim at Republican opponent Donald Trump, calling him a convicted criminal who is only out for himself. Donald Trump campaigns in Detroit, in the swing state of Michigan, with African-American voters. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg meets with President Biden at the White House a few weeks before the NATO leaders' summit comes to Washington, the two announcing progress in the number of NATO countries that have hit the minimum 2% of gross domestic product spent on defense. Israel says it will pause fighting in an area in southern Gaza for 11 hours a day to allow more humanitarian aid to reach Palestinians, but will not stop its offensive against Hamas. And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the war cabinet has been disbanded now that a key member from a rival political faction has left. We'll get U.S. State Department and White House reaction. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer schedules a bill to ban firearm bump stocks after last week's Supreme Court decision that the devices could not be prohibited under a law banning machine guns because although bump stocks can make a gun fire rapidly, the devices do not meet the definition of machine guns. And the Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy urging Congress to require a warning label on social media, like the label on tobacco, that using the platforms can harm teenagers' mental health. Story from the Baltimore Sun, Governor Wes Moore issued more than 175,000 pardons for misdemeanor cannabis possession and use convictions Monday morning, one of the largest state-issued pardons in the United States history. Marylanders voted on an overwhelming margin to approve recreational use cannabis for adults during the 2022 general election. Cannabis officially became legalized in the state July 1st, 2023. At least a quarter of these pardons will apply to convictions in Baltimore City. Marylanders of color, particularly the black community, have been disproportionately represented among these convictions. That was the story from the Baltimore Sun. Governor Moore made his announcement at a news conference at the State House in the capital city, Annapolis.
When it comes to cannabis, rolling out one of the best and most equitable legal markets in the country is incredibly important. But that rollout must go hand in hand with pardoning past conduct, and Maryland is going to lead by example. Yes, yeah. So today, this executive order is the most sweeping state-level pardon in any state in American history. That's right. And the action that we take together this morning is going to directly impact tens of thousands of Marylanders. So first, I will grant pardons to Marylanders who have been convicted for misdemeanor possession of cannabis. And second, I will grant full pardons to Marylanders who have been convicted of certain misdemeanor possession crimes of drug paraphernalia. So we aren't nibbling around the edges. We are taking actions that are intentional, that are sweeping, and unapologetic. And this is the largest such action in our nation's history. But there's a reason that we're being so intentional today. And there's a reason that we're moving so swiftly. And that reason is because we've studied our history. Policymaking is powerful. And if you look at the past, you see how policies have been intentionally deployed to hold back entire communities. We're talking about tools that have led to the mass incarceration of black men and boys. We're talking about tools that have led to restricted access to jobs and housing in minority communities. We're talking about tools that have led to an 8-to-1 racial wealth gap in our state. Because we know we do not get to an 8-to-1 racial wealth gap because one group is working 8 times harder. Tools that have been used to create these disparities. And to undo that kind of intentionality, we need to apply intentionality of our own. So today, we take a big step enacting the kinds of policies that can reverse the harm of the past and to help us to work together to build a brighter future.
Governor Wes Moore, Democrat from Maryland, at a news conference in Annapolis. His office says the pardons will not result in the release of anyone currently in prison because the cases receiving the pardons for misdemeanor use or drug paraphernalia are not tied in with convictions on other charges. Story from the New York Times. President Biden's campaign on Monday began its most aggressive effort to brand former President Donald J. Trump a felon with the introduction of a new television advertisement that focuses on the presumptive Republican presidential nominee's criminal conviction. The campaign said the ad would be part of a $50 million investment in battleground states in June. A growing number of Democrats have been urging the president to become more aggressive in branding Mr. Trump with his criminal conviction. That was the reporting from the New York Times. Here is the ad.
In the courtroom, we see Donald Trump for who he is. He's been convicted of 34 felonies, found liable for sexual assault, and he committed financial fraud. Meanwhile, Joe Biden's been working, lowering health care costs and making big corporations pay their fair share. This election is between a convicted criminal who's only out for himself and a president who's fighting for your family.
I'm Joe Biden, and I approve this message.
The new Biden-Harris reelection TV ad issued today. Mitchell Andrew, the campaign's national co-chair, was interviewed on CNN about it.
What this ad is about showing the American people about the issue that's going to decide this campaign: wisdom, courage, character. You have a choice between two people. You have somebody like Joe Biden who wakes up every day. He's fighting hard for American citizens. He's working hard to lower prices. He's building 56,000 projects across the country. And in the meantime, you have another stark choice, one of the most dramatic stark choices in the history of our country. Somebody who is, in fact, a convicted felon of 34 felonies. Also, most of the people around him when he ran for office before have been convicted or in jail. 17 of his cabinet members have now said they won't vote for him, including his vice president. He's been bankrupt 6 times. He's been determined to have been liable for sexual assault, for defamation, and for business fraud. Now, that just is like the choice, and that's the choice that American voters are going to face in a couple of months, and you're going to see the clear difference between the two in the debate that you guys are going to host in just a couple of weeks.
Mitchell Andrew, Biden-Harris reelection campaign national co-chair, on CNN today. Trump 2024 National Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt posting on X about the new Biden-Harris TV ad. Quote, "Crooked Joe Biden and the Democrats weaponized the justice system against President Trump, and this new ad once again proves the sham trial was always meant to be election interference. But Americans see through it. Despite Biden's failing campaign spending, nearly $70 million on media buys, President Trump continues to crush Joe Biden in the polls, leading in every key battleground state and winning independents by double digits. Crooked Joe Biden is down 20 points with black voters in Pennsylvania and just needed to be led off stage by Obama in a room full of Hollywood elites. The contrast between President Trump's strength and success versus crooked Joe Biden's weakness, failures, and dishonesty will be made clear on the debate stage next week." That was a statement by Caroline Leavitt, Donald Trump 2024 National Press Secretary. About being led off stage, this came up at today's White House briefing with Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre.
There seems to be a sort of rash of videos that have been edited to make the president appear especially frail or mentally confused. I'm wondering if the White House is especially worried about the fact that this appears to be a pattern that we're seeing more of often.
Yeah, and I think you all have called this the cheap fakes video, and that's exactly what they are. They are cheap fakes video. They are done in bad faith, and some of your news organization have been very clear, have stressed that these the right-wing critics of the president have a credibility problem because of the fact checkers have repeatedly caught them pushing misinformation, disinformation, and so we see this, and this is something coming from your part of the world, calling them cheap fakes and misinformation. And I'll quote the Washington Post, where they wrote about this, and they said how Republicans use misleading videos to attack Biden in a 24-hour period. And to their credit, we have a conservative Washington Examiner did call them out as well, calling out the New York Post. Ironically, several recent cheap fakes actually attacked the president for thanking troops. For thanking troops. That is what they're attacking the president for. Both in Normandy this happened, and again in Italy. And I think that it tells you everything that we need to know about how desperate Republicans are here. Instead of talking about the president's performance in office, and what I mean by that is his legislative wins, what he's been able to do for the American people across the country, we're seeing these deep fakes, these manipulated videos. And it is, again, done in bad faith.
White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre at her news conference at the White House. The headline of that story in the New York Post on Sunday, Biden appears to freeze up, has to be led off stage by Obama at Megabucks LA fundraiser. From the Detroit Free Press, former President Donald Trump held a roundtable discussion in Detroit on Saturday as his campaign attempts to court black voters away from President Joe Biden in this year's election. Trump spoke about a myriad of topics in a speech that lasted around 20 minutes, including subjects he's repeatedly addressed in his campaign, like inflation, Biden's handling of the U.S. southern border with Mexico, and his general opposition to an embrace of electric vehicles. Following the speech, a 20-minute roundtable discussion with small business owners and other community members moderated by U.S. Congressman Byron Donalds, Republican of Florida, took place. The Detroit Free Press article also says, but in a city he only received 5% of the vote in 4 years ago, he also pitched himself as a better choice for black voters than Biden, telling a diverse crowd he would crack down on crime, improve the country's economic outlook, and in general, do more for black Americans than Biden has. Here's part of that event with Donald Trump in Detroit on Saturday.
We passed historic criminal justice reform, something that they've been after, people have been after for mostly the black community for years and years. And to get it done, they needed me. And as you know, President Obama tried. Biden doesn't even try. Well, he doesn't have to because we got it done, but we're going to get it improved. But President Obama tried, was unable to get it done. You needed conservative votes, and I got conservative votes, and we got criminal justice reform done. Nobody else could have done that. And we're very proud of it. When I left office, we had no inflation. Gasoline was less than $2. The 30-year mortgage was at 2.6%. The border was secure. Wages were rising, and the jobs were the best in the history of our country for African American, for black Americans. The jobs were the best in the history of our country. Other than that, what did I do? Not that much. Not that much. Now watch, the press will put that on. I didn't do that much because they're bad people. You know, they're bad. That's why they're the fake news. You have the same problem that I do. They're fake news. So Biden, on the other hand, Biden wrote the devastating 1994 crime bill, talking about super predators. That was Biden. You know, he walks around now talking about the black vote. He's the king of the super predators. And he wrote the 1994 crime bill that you talk about so much. I guess everybody here knows about that, especially if you happen to be black. And he was the one with the super predators. So just please remember that when you think you're going to vote Democrat, because you shouldn't vote Democrat. Biden's inflation. Thank you. That's a big deal, too, because, you know, he tries to pretend like, oh, you know, nothing happened, nothing happened. He was the one. Biden's inflation has cost a typical American family $28,000. Millions of illegal aliens are pouring in, and they're taking your jobs. The black community is being hurt more by the illegal aliens, 16, 17 million. They're taking your jobs. You're down 6-7% from where you were just 3 years ago with me. And it's going much lower because millions and millions of people are coming into your communities. It's no longer every state is a border state. You've heard that. But they're coming into your community and they're taking your job. They're affecting the African Americans, and then after that, the Hispanic Americans more than any other group.
Former President Donald Trump, the presumptive 2024 Republican presidential nominee, at a roundtable discussion on Saturday at a non-denominational church in Detroit. An article from the Detroit Free Press says that the event drew hundreds of people and had high-profile figures, including U.S. Congressman John James, Republican, former police chief James Craig, and Detroit rapper Sada Baby. Story from Fox News. Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat from Massachusetts, is pressing her fellow Democrats to take tough stances on new tax policy as lawmakers prepare for the expiration of part of the Trump-era tax cuts after 2025. Speaking at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth during an event titled The Promise of Equitable and Pro-Growth Tax Reform, the progressive lawmaker stressed the importance of championing tax reforms to crack down on corporations. That was Fox News. Here's Senator Elizabeth Warren.
4 out of 5 Americans support raising taxes on the rich. That's 80% of all Americans, Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And take a closer look at those Trump voters. Nearly 2 out of 3 voters who pulled the lever for Donald Trump in 2020 say they support raising taxes on the rich. If Democrats play hardball on taxing billionaires, America will be with us. Raising taxes on the rich for other programs makes those programs even more popular. For example, big investment like childcare is incredibly popular, but when childcare is paired with a plan to pay for it by raising taxes on wealthy and on large corporations, it becomes even more popular, up 4 percentage points overall, and up 7 points with independents and 6 points with Republicans. In other words, when we talk about taxes to pay for the programs we want, we build broader support for those programs. At a time when people have grown cynical about democratic promises, showing our willingness to tax billionaires and giant corporations to pay for those programs strengthens our credibility. A 2-cent wealth tax would pay for universal child care, cancel all student loan debt, make technical school 2-year and 4-year colleges free, create a $5 billion investment in historically black colleges and universities, and give every public K-12 school in America $1 million to invest in the way that best meets their specific needs. When we remind people of that, we invite them to dream big for our children and for our nation, and to reject the answer that we can't make our country a better place because Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk don't want to pay taxes.
Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat from Massachusetts, at a program in Washington hosted by the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, focusing on what's going to happen when part of the Trump tax cuts expire in 2025. Story from Associated Press. The IRS plans to end a major tax loophole for wealthy taxpayers that could raise more than $50 billion in revenue over the next decade, the U.S. Treasury Department says. The proposed rule and guidance announced Monday includes plans to essentially stop partnership basis shifting, a process by which a business or person can move assets among a series of related parties to avoid paying taxes. On Wall Street today, the Dow up 188, Nasdaq up 168, S&P up 41. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, writes Politico, announced Monday that more than 20 members of the Transatlantic Alliance will meet defense spending targets this year, a major issue as Republicans accuse European partners of not contributing their share to the common defense. Speaking in Washington on Monday, the Norwegian diplomat said he plans to inform President Joe Biden during their meeting later. The announcement comes 4 months after Stoltenberg projected 18 countries would meet the goal. That was from Politico. General Stoltenberg spoke at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in the morning before heading to the White House to meet President Biden in the afternoon. Washington, D.C. will be hosting the NATO summit in about 3 weeks.
Secretary General, welcome back to the Oval Office. I have to say ahead of time, I'm going to miss you. I'm going to miss you. You know, I believe this is one of the most consequential moments for Europe since World War II. I think you do too. NATO was founded 75 years ago, and I think the lessons we've learned then and about standing together to defend and deter aggression have been consequential. And we've made NATO, under your leadership, we made it larger, stronger, and then it's more united than it's ever been. So I want to thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for the incredible work you've done. Together, we're deterred further Russian aggression in Europe. I know we welcome Finland and Sweden to the alliance. And we strengthened NATO's eastern flank, making it clear that we'll defend every single inch of NATO territory. And John, it's a very important announcement to make today. A record number of allies meeting the NATO commitment to at least 2% of their GDP on defense. And in fact, the number is more than double since I took office, and I look forward to building it on all this progress next month when we have the 75th meeting here in Washington. And I look forward to our discussion today. So I want to thank you for being here. We got a lot to talk about, and I mean it sincerely. You've been great. I just wish you'd extend your term another 10 years. You're doing a hell of a job. Seriously.
President Biden, dear Joe, thank you so much for your warm words, and thank you so much for your personal commitment to NATO, to our transatlantic alliance. And also many thanks for hosting the NATO summit here in Washington, D.C. Next month. At that summit, we will celebrate the 75th anniversary of the most successful alliance in history, but we'll also make important decisions for the future. Not least on the issue and the importance of investing in our security. And today we are able to publish new figures for defense spending. They show that across Europe and Canada, NATO allies are this year increasing defense spending by 18%. That's the biggest increase in decades. 23 allies are going to spend 2% of GDP or more on defense this year. That's more than twice as many as 4 years ago, and demonstrates that European allies and Canada are really stepping up and taking their share of the common responsibility to protect all of us in the NATO alliance. It's also important for the United States to know that a lot of this money is actually spent here in the United States. Allies are buying more and more equipment from the US, so NATO is good for US security, but NATO is also good for US jobs. Mr. President, let me also thank you for your strong leadership on Ukraine, and congratulations on the bilateral security agreement you signed with President Zelensky with Ukraine. European allies are also stepping up and matching the US contributions to military support to Ukraine. And I expect that when we meet here next month, we will agree to have a NATO in the lead role in providing security assistance and training, and also that allies will agree to step up financial and military support to Ukraine. This will reduce the burden on the United States and strengthen our support to Ukraine. I think it's important to understand that the stronger our support for Ukraine is, the sooner this war can end, because the sooner President Putin will realize that he cannot wait us out. It is in support Ukraine is not charity, support Ukraine is in our own security interest, and therefore I welcome the strong commitment of all NATO allies to continue to support Ukraine. So once again, thank you so much. Thank you for once again hosting me here in the Oval Office, and I look very much forward to the NATO summit in Washington, D.C. next month. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President.
In the White House Oval Office, President Joe Biden hosting the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, the two not answering any of the reporters' questions. Story from the New York Times, President Vladimir V. Putin of Russia will visit North Korea this week for a meeting with its leader Kim Jong-un, at their second in 9 months, as the two countries deepen military ties to support Mr. Putin's war in Ukraine with North Korean weapons. And from CTV in Canada, a fleet of Russian warships, including a nuclear-powered submarine, left Havana's port on Monday after a 5-day visit to Cuba following planned military drills in the Atlantic Ocean. The exercise had been seen by some as a show of strength by Moscow against the backdrop of tensions as U.S. and other Western nations support Kyiv in Russia's war on Ukraine. The submarine, a frigate, an oil tanker, and a rescue tug slowly departed from the port on Monday morning. Congressman Michael Turner, Republican from Ohio, Intelligence Committee Chair, spoke about this on the podcast Fox News Rundown.
Russia has sent ships to our hemisphere, with a few now docked in Havana, Cuba. What's your assessment of the situation brewing in the Caribbean, and what can we do to protect ourselves if a Russian partnership grows in Cuba once again?
Well, this is part of the visible expression of the Biden weakness on the world stage. Russia is challenging the United States, not just in Ukraine, not just in Europe, but really around the world. They're doing so even in buzzing our aircraft that are in Europe, flying dangerously close without real response from this administration. Since the administration is afraid to stand up because they believe they'll be provocative, when in fact they should be responding to Russia's provocations, Russia continues to become more aggressive.
Congressman Michael Turner, Republican from Ohio, chair of the Intelligence Committee, on the Fox News podcast, Fox News Rundown. The House is not in session in Washington this week. White House spokesperson John Kirby was asked about this during a White House news conference.
A Russian fleet has reportedly left Havana. Do you know where it's going and what your level of concern is about it?
I can't speak for the Russian Navy. No, I don't have insight as to what their course and speed is and where they're going. And we've already talked about this. It's important to keep it in perspective. The Russians do this every few years. They make an excursion to the Caribbean and to Latin American waters. It's not new. Did it under Trump, did it under Obama, did it under President Bush. We watch it closely and monitor it as we should, no question about that. But as I've said earlier, this excursion of theirs doesn't pose a national security threat to the American people or to the homeland.
John Kirby, White House National Security Communications Advisor at today's White House news conference. This is Washington Today. From Reuters, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu criticized plans announced by the military on Sunday to hold daily tactical pauses in fighting along one of the main roads into Gaza to facilitate aid delivery into the Palestinian enclave. The military had announced the daily pauses from 0500 Greenwich Mean Time to 1600 GMT in the area from the Kerem Shalom crossing to the Salah al-Din Road and then northwards. The military clarified that normal operations would continue in Rafah, the main focus of its operation in southern Gaza, where 8 soldiers were killed on Saturday. The reaction from Netanyahu underlined political tensions over the issue of aid coming into Gaza, where international organizations have warned of a growing humanitarian crisis. That story from Reuters. The Biden administration welcomed this pause. Here is the State Department spokesperson, Matthew Miller.
The Israeli government over the weekend announced these tactical pauses that they say is meant to increase the amount of aid that's going around Gaza. Aid groups say they haven't seen any impact at this point. What's the U.S. read on this?
So that is a step that we very much welcome. It's something that we have been encouraging for some time. Our special envoy for Middle East humanitarian issues, Lise Grande, has been directly advocating for these pauses in her conversation with Israeli officials, and she's been doing that because of her work on the ground, meeting with UN relief agencies and other relief agencies about what they need to be able to deliver humanitarian assistance inside Gaza. We continue to have a tough situation where there is now a fair amount of aid that's making it to Kerem Shalom, but then not always being distributed from Kerem Shalom to the inside of Gaza. Some of that is because of the conflict in Rafah. Some of that is the instability in the security situation on the ground, where you see trucks that are in some instances attacked by
private parties, by looters and criminals. This removes one of those obstacles. Now, look, it'll probably take a few days to see how it's actually implemented for people to adjust to this new reality, but we think it's a step that's very positive that ought to improve the distribution situation inside Gaza.
And how does the U.S. intend to hold Israel accountable for honoring these tactical pauses? We've seen a number of instances where they said that areas were protected, that humanitarians would be protected, and then ultimately the results on the ground don't bear that out.
So ultimately we judge Israel by the results. And when it comes to it's not just a question of humanitarian pauses, it's the question of how much aid gets delivered. The pause ultimately is only a means to an end. The humanitarian pause is to ensure that, number one, aid can get delivered where it needs to go, and then number two, relief workers have certainty that they can carry out their jobs without being hit by an airstrike or by tank fire or by any other kind of ordinance. So it's important that Israel has put this step in place, and we'll watch how it's implemented. And if there are changes that need to be made, we of course won't hesitate to make that clear.
State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller at his news conference at the State Department in Washington. From CBS News, political tension in Israel over the conduct of the country's war against Hamas in the Gaza Strip spilled out into public view again Monday. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu disbanded an influential group that had, since Hamas launched its October 7th terrorist attack and sparked the war, helped to set Israel's war policy. Netanyahu dissolved the war cabinet, a coalition of political rivals created after the Hamas attack to both sow and show unity at the top level of the Israeli government during the conflict. That unity collapsed last week when Benny Gantz, Netanyahu's leading moderate opponent, resigned from his position in the government and the war cabinet over what he had said was a failure to present any plan to govern Gaza following the war. That was from CBS News. Israeli government spokesperson David Mencer brought this up in his news conference during his opening statement.
On the war cabinet being replaced by the security cabinet, the Prime Minister said, quote, "The war cabinet in the coalition agreement with National Unity MK Benny Gantz at his requests. With Mr. Gantz leaving the government, there is no more need for this extra branch of government. The security cabinet is granted authority by the state to make decisions together with the full cabinet."
David Mencer, Israeli government spokesperson, an opening statement during a virtual news conference, and a reaction to this from White House spokesperson John Kirby.
Can you give us your response to Prime Minister Netanyahu's move to disband his war cabinet? He seems to think that there's no need for an extra branch of government as it was described to us. Do you agree that the war cabinet isn't necessary right now?
Well, that's really up to the Prime Minister to decide, Mary. This is the war cabinet was an internal domestic measure taken by the Prime Minister to better advise and provide him counsel on the war. We said at the time that we believed it was a worthwhile step, and we still hold by that. But with Mr. Gantz's decision to leave, I'm not sure that Prime Minister Netanyahu was left with a whole lot of other choices.
And more broadly speaking, how concerned is the president right now that far-right voices in the Israeli government may wield more power?
That's going to be up to Israeli leaders, and that's going to be up to the Prime Minister. We deal with the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is the elected head of the Israeli government. That's who the president deals with. He will continue to do so. They don't agree on everything. They're not going to agree on everything going forward, but they have a long relationship with one another, and they know that they both have an open line to one another. So we're going to leave it at that.
John Kirby, White House National Security Communications Advisor at today's White House news conference. Democratic Congressman Steny Hoyer, writes CNN, will lead a bipartisan congressional delegation to Israel this week, a notable show of support as a sizable number of Democrats say they are considering boycotting Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's address to Congress next month. Washington Today continues in a moment.
The House will be in order.
This year, C-SPAN celebrates 45 years of covering Congress like no other. Since 1979, we've been your primary source for Capitol Hill, providing balanced, unfiltered coverage of government, taking you to where the policy's debated and decided, all with the support of America's cable companies. C-SPAN, 45 years and counting, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you find your podcasts. From thehill.com, the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, is planning to hold a vote on legislation to ban gun bump stocks this week after the Supreme Court invalidated the Trump-era ban. The Supreme Court last week invalidated the national ban on bump stocks, which can convert semi-automatic weapons to ones capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute. The Trump administration issued a final rule prohibiting bump stocks in 2018 following the 2017 Las Vegas mass shooting, which was the deadliest in U.S. history. That story from The Hill. Here's Senator Schumer on the Senate floor.
Last Friday, Madam President, the MAGA Supreme Court struck once again, saying the federal government cannot prohibit the use of bump stocks, the accessory responsible for the deadliest shooting in American history. Nearly 7 years ago, a lone shooter fired over 1,000 rounds in just 10 minutes upon a crowd of concertgoers in Las Vegas. 60 innocent people were murdered. Another 850 were injured. This was all possible because the shooter modified his rifles to function essentially as machine guns. The AFT under the Trump administration, banned the use of these accessories shortly after the Las Vegas shooting. Yet on Friday, the MAGA court reached the incredible conclusion that weapons modified to act like machine guns, to fire bullets at almost the same rate as machine guns, and in which, in Judge Alito's own admission, do not show, quote, any material difference, unquote, with machine guns, are somehow not machine guns, which have been banned for a very long time, since the 30s. Friday's ruling is yet another warning that this MAGA court is going off the deep end, aligning itself more and more with the most extreme elements of the hard right. They have struck down freedom of choice, environmental protections, affirmative action, fair redistricting, gun safety, and more. The MAGA Supreme Court is now even further to the right of Donald Trump, who's very hard right himself. So this week, the Senate will step in to try and fix the chaos the MAGA court just unleashed. As soon as tomorrow, Democrats will seek passage of a federal ban on bump stocks. And I urge my Republican colleagues not to block Senator Heinrich when he comes to the floor. He's the author of the bill banning bump stocks and leading the charge to get it passed quickly. Passing a bill banning bump stocks should be the work of 5 minutes. Most Americans support this step. Poll after poll show that a majority of people, including independents, support restrictions on AR-15-style rifles, which is what bump stocks are designed to emulate. I understand that the issue of gun safety provokes intense disagreement in Congress, but shouldn't we all agree that preventing another tragedy like Las Vegas is just plain common sense and a good thing? Banning bump stocks would go a long way to making it harder for murderers to carry out large shootings. So I hope our Republican colleagues join us.
The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, on the Senate floor. President Biden has said he would sign a bill banning gun bump stocks immediately if Congress passes one. WCSC-TV, Charleston, South Carolina, reports that Mother Emanuel AME Church is remembering the 9 parishioners of the church who were gunned down in a shooting on June 17th, 2015. Monday marks the 9th anniversary of the Charleston church shooting. The shooting claimed the lives of the church's lead pastor, the Reverend Clementa Pickney, and 8 of its parishioners. The church held a remembrance service Monday in honor of the victims. Following that service, family members took part in a balloon release on the church's steps. The shooting happened at the end of a Wednesday night Bible study and was the result of what investigators called a hate-motivated attack that was carried out by Dylan Roof, who was then 21 years old. Roof told investigators that he hoped to start a race war. That was reporting from WCSC-TV Charleston. Senator Tim Scott, Republican of South Carolina, posted a video today on the anniversary.
9 years ago, one of the greatest tragedies in the state history occurred at Mother Emanuel Church. 9 innocent Christian lives snuffed out by hate. Clementa Pinkney, a very good friend of mine, the first person to ever call me a senator, When I texted him, he couldn't respond. I'll simply say this, that when hate rages and you're a Christian, 9 Christian souls, love prevailed. They held on to, clung to Matthew 5:44. Love those who hate you. Pray for those who persecute you. Because of 9 lives, South Carolina has changed forever. We saw people coming together, hand in hand, tens of thousands on the Ravenel Bridge, saying hate will not consume this state. Love will rise to the occasion. And it did. I'll never forget my conversation with Daniel Simmons Jr., whose father had just passed away 7 days earlier. He said to me, when you go out there and speak, remind them of Romans 8:28, that all these things will somehow work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. That God will take the attacks of the enemy and somehow and in some way turn it into good. God bless Mother Emanuel Church. God bless the great state of South Carolina. And may we honor the sacrifice by coming together in a unified spirit of love.
Senator Tim Scott, Republican from South Carolina, posting that video on X. From Associated Press, the U.S. Surgeon General has called on Congress to require warning labels on social media platforms similar to those now mandatory on cigarette boxes. In a Monday opinion piece in the New York Times, Dr. Vivek Murthy said that social media is a contributing factor to the mental health crisis among young people. Dr. Murthy was interviewed this morning on NBC's Today Show.
What the data is telling us, Savannah, is not only have companies not demonstrated that their platforms are safe for kids, but there's growing evidence of harm. It shows us, in fact, that when adolescents spend more than 3 hours a day on social media, we're seeing an association with a doubling of risk of anxiety and depression symptoms. And the average amount of use per day among adolescents is nearly 5 hours. So that's deeply concerning to me, not just as Surgeon General, but as a parent myself. Now, a warning label would help parents to understand these risks. Many parents don't know that those risks exist. And we have data from tobacco warning labels that, in fact, tells us that they can be helpful in changing awareness and changing behavior. Keep in mind, when Congress authorized these labels for tobacco more than half a century ago, or nearly half a century ago, the smoking rate in America was above 40%. Today, it's under 12%. That's an extraordinary amount of progress. Labels were a part of that effort.
U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy, Monday morning on the NBC News Today Show. At the White House news conference later in the day, Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre was asked if President Biden supports requiring a warning label for social media.
The Surgeon General is calling for this warning label on social media platforms. The President and the administration have been clear. You support addressing mental health tied to social media, especially among young people. But does the President support this action? Does he support a warning label like this as a means to addressing this crisis?
And to your question, Mary Bruce, you're absolutely right. There's a mental health issue. Our young people are experiencing an unprecedented mental health crisis. That's what we're seeing, and there is undeniable evidence of this, that social media and other online platforms are contributing to this. It is exactly why the President and the First Lady, this administration, has done everything that they can to really tackle the mental health crisis as part of, let's not forget, it's part of their key agenda as we talk about the unity agenda, because we believe that is something that could bring both sides together, because we're seeing this in red states and in blue states. And so we have invested resources to deal with this issue, establishing the new Center of Excellence on Social Media and Mental Wellness, launching the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. I just talked about that as it relates to LGBTQ+ youth, and launching a new interagency task force on kids' online health and safety. So there is a mental health crisis. The Surgeon General's announcement is about reminding parents and also about reminding kids the risk of using of using social media. So we were going to continue to focus on that. Obviously, the Surgeon General is going to continue focus on that as the country's doctor, physician. So I think that's important that he'll continue to do that work. And we're going to continue to look at a range of actions as the Surgeon General is trying to do as well.
But does the president support a warning label like this?
I mean, look, what I would say is that we want to, as I stated in the unity agenda, we want to see a bipartisan approach in dealing with this issue, right? On how to hold social media companies accountable. The Surgeon General made this announcement, reminding parents, reminding kids what's at stake here, understanding that mental health is a crisis. There is a crisis here in America, but we believe that the way to move forward, the best way to move forward, as we say, there's always going to be policies that we're going to introduce from here, but the best way to move forward is to deal with this in a bipartisan way. We believe that this is why we included it in the unity agenda. This is going to be a continuation of what this president does in his term here. Is let's deal with this in a bipartisan way because it matters. It's not about red states or blue states.
The White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre during her regular news conference at the White House. A story from the LA Times, the Los Angeles Unified School District campuses could become cell phone and social media free places. The Los Angeles Unified Board will consider on Tuesday directing staff to collect feedback and create a policy that would ban student phones and social media use from bell to bell. Board member Nick Melvoin, who authored the resolution with the board president Jackie Goldberg and member Tanya Ortiz-Franklin, said, "I think that we can do more to monitor the school day to make sure that kids are focused, that their mental health doesn't suffer, and that they get some more time to just be with one another." The district's current policy technically bars phone and social media use in class, but educators say even that is unevenly enforced. Story from the LA Times. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Subscribe to C-SPAN's free evening newsletter Word for Word, and you'll get the stories making headlines in Washington sent to your inbox every day. Sign up at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.